Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Advances in Autism Research and Care webinar. We're thrilled to have you. Just a quick housekeeping reminder, if you have questions throughout the webinar, you can use the chat feature to send to myself as the organizer, and we can read them out to our presenter at the end. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenter for the day. We have Mark Stokes, who's actually calling in all the way from Australia, so we're very excited to have him. Mark has been involved in research around autism since 1992. He got his PhD from La Trobe University in 1996, and after his PhD, Mark undertook a postdoctoral position at Monza University, followed by an appointment at Vanderbilt, then again at Monza University. In 2002, Mark was appointed to Deakin University, where he developed research programs into autism, sexuality, and relationship development, the female profile of autism, and mirror neurons in autism. Mark has published over 60 peer-reviewed publications, 8 book chapters, and numerous reports to government, more than 100 conference presentations, and raised $3 million in grants and contracts, and supervised 20 doctoral and PhD completions. Mark has a history of involvement in initiatives to promote research into autism, including Autism Victoria's ASD Research Group, the Australasian Autism Research Collaboration, and in the inception of the Australasian Society for Autism Research. Mark has also been an active child injury prevention board member and former president of KidSafe. So we're very lucky and excited to have Mark here today, and so I will give him the floor. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Lucy. I was going to correct a couple of things there, and I apologise for my broad Australian accent. I'll slow my speaking down so that it's more intelligible. The first thing I've actually got to correct is it's now 27 PhD students, and the second thing is it's 120 papers. And I'm president of the Australasian Society for Autism Research, and I was president of KidSafe for many years. KidSafe, for those of you who don't know what it is, that's a child injury prevention charity. In fact, we founded the very first of them in Australia, and the first was KidSafe, which I'm very proud of. I wasn't one of the founders. I was just the dumb bunny who got caught. Anyway, today is not about that. Today is about the mental health of sexual and gender minorities in autism. And you're probably sort of looking at that graphic up the front there and wondering who spilt coffee everywhere all over the screen, which is basically what I thought when I first saw these. And I'll show you what these are later. But let me just say that those symbols there, some of you may recognise, many of you won't. And they are supposedly a language, and that is supposedly saying something that's quite pertinent to today. So we'll come to that later. Now, in terms of language, throughout, and in accordance with community preferences, and if you're looking for a study that identifies these preferences, Liz Pellicano published a couple of papers with Tony Charman and that group a few years ago in Autism, evaluating the way autistic individuals want researchers to speak about autism. So I'll be conforming with that, and I'll be using identity first language to describe individuals with a diagnosis of autism and traits related to autism. So I'll be using things such as autistic person and autistic traits. Similarly, with gender inclusive language, in order to describe gender, I'll use terms like cisgender, which, for those of you unfamiliar with that term, means those who identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, transgender, and non-binary. And I'll also use LGBTIQ inclusive language, excuse me, to describe sexuality, using terms such as gay, lesbian, bisexual, asexual, etc. But unfortunately, some research that I'm going to present was conducted using earlier language preferences. And it's not scientifically acceptable to edit this now, as meaning can be changed quite subtly over time with successive changes. You could imagine a situation, excuse me, You can imagine a situation where we have a piece of research done on a group, say, that had Asperger's, and we changed that to a more accepted term at some point, say autism spectrum disorder, and then some point later we changed that to autistic individuals. And in those three changes, or those two changes actually, we've suddenly lost something quite important and subtle in the meaning of Asperger's, because Asperger's used to mean individuals who had intelligence in the normal range, amongst other things. And so we have to use language that was used at the time of the data collected, because otherwise we change the meaning. And hence I'm constrained at times with some data and some figures to use older language and older nomenclature. And I really apologise for that. I'm not intending to give offence. I'm not intending to alienate people. And I'm really very sorry if that does. But in order to keep scientific consistency, I have to use it. But where appropriate, I have adjusted this language. Now, I just want to acknowledge my many collaborators, and there are probably people forgotten off this list. I always manage to forget people off this list. The ones that are starred are current or previous doctoral or PhD students. The ones who aren't starred are otherwise unsullied by their association with me, and they have their own opinions. The starred ones have to argue with me to have an opinion, because I'm a tyrant. And I just want to acknowledge, I always acknowledge this individual. Well, I should acknowledge several here, but the first, of course, at the top is my wife, Dr. Janine Mangione. And so as a consequence, I acknowledge her. But there's one in there on the lower right who I was a special person, Louise Dove, who the last time I saw her, she walked out of my office saying, "Don't worry, Mark, I will be Dr. Dove." And she was dead 2 days later. So I just always acknowledge Louise and her family and the grief that they've gone through. Right. So why study mental health in sexual and gender minorities within autism? There's a number of reasons for this, and I can give the whole bunch of scientific reasons, which I will give. And there's personal reasons for this as well. The first is, of course, we'll talk about the scientific reasons. 2 to 3% of children born obtain a diagnosis of autism in Australia. And that's a fairly similar figure in the United States, a little bit lower if you look at some results, a little bit higher if you look at others. And if you consider that the female profile is an expanding profile, and I'll mention this later, that 3% is a very likely figure. These go on to be adults for at least 40 to 80 years. Now, one of the other projects I work in is the Global Burden of Disease, and a very worthy project that is. And in the Global Burden of Disease, it is very clear that there is a vast population, a reservoir of individuals with autism, and they live for a substantial period of time. And you can imagine that there's an incredible burden on society if someone is living with a mental health condition for that entire time. Now, I know that the mental health care systems in the Western countries have collapsed compared to where they were some years ago. They are no longer supported as they were. But in Australia, our mental health care system is probably still in somewhat stronger health than it is in many other parts of the world. And I think we'll find that other parts of the world, given that mental health is now recognised in the Global Burden of Disease and in World Health Organization figures as, if not the leading cause of morbidity and amongst the leading causes of mortality, it certainly will be very shortly in pretty much the entire Western Hemisphere. So mental health and addressing mental health, sorry, I'm just getting over a bit of a cold. Addressing mental health saves society money in the long term. Now, I'm not going to get into an econometrics argument as to how that is so. There are plenty of papers around that show this is the case. But more importantly, mental health is a good to be sought in and of itself. And to illustrate that, imagine a world if we lived in it and everybody had poor mental health. I think most of us don't want to live in that world. Most of us want to live in a world where mental health is something that we all have, and it's something that is noted in the American Constitution, that every person has a right to pursue happiness. And it's very hard to be happy if you don't have mental health. Sorry. Mental health is obtained when functional well-being is obtained. And another area of research that I seem to do a lot of research. Another area of research I work in is in well-being and looking at questions around well-being with Bob Cummins, and I work on the development of the Personal Wellbeing Index, which I'll mention later. And we know from that work and other work done by groups such as Dina's group that sufficient resources, when available to meet life's hazards, which are often found in a job, is necessary to functional well-being being obtained, as is having a life meaning that contributes to value externally. And by value externally, I don't mean money, I mean to being valued, to contributing to the world around you, to the society in which you live. This is often found in relationships or in having a job. Many of you, no doubt, know individuals with autism, and you know that when they get work, often their mental health improves. And it comes about because they have some value in life. Many of you may have had a period of unemployment, and you'll know that just how intimidating and threatening that can be, how restrictive on your life it can be. And the other thing that's necessary for healthy well-being is having a relationship to others that validates. Now, I say there's often found in a relationship, and by that I'm meaning two different kinds of relationships here. A relationship to others means some kind of connection to other people and communities around you. And when I say it's often found in a relationship, what I mean is one of those special and intimate relationships often provides a relationship that validates. But it's not the only way that relationships to others can validate. It's quite frequently the case that I do in my clinical work that I suggest to people that they volunteer, and in volunteering with others, they find a connection to others around them that's useful and meaningful, and it validates them and improves their mental well-being. Now, deprived of these particular aspects, we know suicidality increases, both suicidal thinking and actual attempts, and success at suicide increases. And as a consequence, well-being and functional mental health are goods to be sought in and of themselves. Now, I said I had a personal reason as well. And on the top of this slide is a genogram of my family. I won't point out where I fit in that family, but you'll see all the dark circles and squares, and the cross-hatched circles and squares indicate individuals with autism. And you can see that it strikes all through my family. It's prevalent. And so I'm consistently aware of a large number of people around me who have autism and need assistance as a consequence. And I don't mean assistance because they're in some way reduced or lesser. I mean assistance in that they are often discriminated against by society, often excluded by society, and the things that go to making well-being for these individuals is not provided. And so they need some assistance to overcome the barriers that are placed in front of them. So why study mental health in sexual and gender minorities, particularly, but within autism? Well, because we know that minority status tends to impact mental health, we predicted that increasing minority status would impact mental health more severely. And the evidence suggests that being a member of a minority may increase health risks. The diagram on the right there, we show a group of individuals with autism. Then we suggest individuals with another condition such as non-heterosexuality or gender dysphoria. And then at the top, all three conditions, autism with gender dysphoria and non-heterosexuality. And so as you become an increasing minority within a minority, we suggest there will be increasing societal pressure and stress, and that stress will be associated with restricted mental health. Now, it's important to note that we're not suggesting that being a member of a minority in and of itself indicates a mental health problem. In fact, quite the contrary. I think it doesn't indicate a mental health problem. Or that the mental health issues are a consequence of class membership. i.e., just because you've got autism doesn't mean you're going to have worsened mental health. I'm implying rather that societal impacts upon individuals in these groups may cause the increased mental health issues. Now, so why look at rules of sexuality and gender? Well, here we have those weird sort of coffee cup stains. And as I said before, I'm saying something about human rules of interaction by using those symbols. And non-conformity to society, non-conformity within society engenders rejection and persecution. I don't think there would be few people who would disagree with that. And I don't know of any psychological evidence, or in fact sociological evidence even, that suggests non-conformity increases acceptance or reduces persecution. Non-conformity is always associated with rejection and persecution by a large majority of people. Not all, but by a large majority. Society has unstated, hidden, implicit rules about acceptable behaviour for sexuality and for gender. And the implicit, hidden nature of these rules renders sexuality difficult for autistic individuals. Now, those funny symbols I've interpreted at the bottom. Up the top here, this symbol is the symbol for human. This symbol is the symbol for choose life. This symbol is the symbol for Ian and Louise eat apple, which of course, for those of us familiar with our theology and Christian theology, would know that eating apples is a metaphor for other things, usually of a sexual nature. And must learn in Louise is this symbol here. These are logographs taken from the recent film Arrival. It's an alien language. These were defined logographs by a group of graphic artists. And as you can see, they are quite confusing to look at. If you try and read them, you can't really read them. By the way, this symbol here, this part of the logograph always tended to turn up when they were trying to say something about humans, and you'll see it just there as well. There's consistency about these. It has many of the properties of a language, but it's not truly a language. And I'm really using these as a way of showing you just how confusing some of the rules about acceptable behaviour can be to someone on the spectrum. It can be extraordinarily intimidating, not just about acceptable behaviour, but about acceptable states of being. Is it acceptable to, for instance, express yourself and say that you are male when you were born female? Is it acceptable to express yourself and say that you are male when you were born female, but still dress in a more feminotypic manner than a masculinotypic manner? Is it acceptable to do all sorts of particular things? And society has rules, even about transitions, that render life difficult for those who don't understand those rules and don't see why they should abide them. And I'm not suggesting they should, by the way. I'm just simply talking about the difficulties. Now, the first thing we need to do is to understand, is there actually more gender dysphoria in autism than one would expect based on just random statistics? And if we look at the papers that have been published in this area, and the chief papers I've listed there, De Vries, Jones, Strang's and van der Meersen's papers, all suggest that there is a heightened level of gender dysphoria. However, others have claimed methodological issues account for these results, such as Durbin and Van Scheltwyk papers. By the way, I disagree with Durbin and Van Scheltwyk. These guys argue that there's been a reliance upon unvalidated instruments to measure gender dysphoria. I disagree with that. Undiagnosed groups being assigned as having autism or as having gender dysphoria. Well, it's a little hard for us to deal with diagnosed groups when their other criticism comes from below, when they say that we've used clinical samples who are more likely to have autism, leading to inflated estimates of autism and gender dysphoria or type 1 error. So they're having it both ways, their argument, and I think that that's an inappropriate way of dealing with it. They argue that we've relied upon small samples. As a mathematical statistician, that's a fallacy. The larger the sample you get, the greater the resolution you get in your analysis, but you don't need a sample of 1 million people to know that bullets kill. You deal with samples in an appropriate size, and the samples that have been looked at provide an appropriate indication of increased levels of gender dysphoria. They say we've used heterogeneous samples confounding results, low functioning autism and high functioning autism. Again, I would disagree. The level of function within autism is not an indication of autism. The level of function, as we now know, is regarded as different from autism. And they say we've used gender and age bias samples, for instance, focusing largely on male adolescents. That's one fair criticism, I would think, but that's largely because, of course, we know that autism up till now is presently more prevalent thought to be more prevalent in males. These are the results that Van Meersen and the others have published. Strang and John Strang and De Vries and Van der Meersen's results. You can see here that compared to the expected values, Van der Meersen found much higher than expected. And we can see that John Strang also found many more endorsed autism than would have been expected. And Van der Meersen undertook a meta-analysis, suggested between 5 and 14% of individuals with autism also have gender dysphoria. When we look at the average values, and I've plotted this here, the Z-scores represent how significant a particular sample was given its sample size and the proportion found. So larger circles represent greater confidence, smaller circles represent less confidence, lower values represent a lower proportion found, and this is the average. Very high confidence found with the average, and it suggests that about 9.9% of those with autism may also have gender dysphoria. That's not to say that they are trans individuals. That is to say they have gender dysphoria, which is some sense of incongruity between one's assigned gender and one's experience of gender. And the 95% confidence intervals are around about 5.7 or 5.5% to about 14%. So we undertook a study, and when I say we, this photograph up here is of my former PhD student, Rita George. And Rita undertook this study as part of her PhD. We recruited participants internationally. The greater proportion, about 85% of individuals, came from North America, the UK, or Australasia, so the Anglosphere. We got 571 respondents, of which 261 were nominally typically developing and 310 were nominally autistic. Vastly more females than males participated. That's what we find. Whenever we do a study of gender or a study of sexuality, we tend to find more females than males. The instruments we used were the DASS-21. The DASS-21, for those of you not familiar with it, is an instrument that measures depression, anxiety, and stress, and it has very, very good psychometrics throughout. We also included the PWI, which again has extraordinarily good psychometrics, and I'm quite proud to say that has been interpreted into 37 different languages, is the basis, well, one of the bases of the World Health Organization's measure of well-being. In fact, it was going to be the World Health Organization's measure of well-being at one stage, but they decided to build their own from it. We used the Gender Identity, Gender Dysphoria questionnaire, which is the GIDI-Q, also has superb psychometrics, and we measured autistic symptomology using Baron Cohen's and Wheelwright's autism spectrum quotient. Again, which has superb psychometrics. All of those instruments were used, I should say, the AQ was used not to diagnose individuals, it's not a diagnostic instrument, but just to get a sense of do we find increased mental health issues with increased levels of autistic symptoms. Our results found that gender dysphoria, we found much higher levels of gender dysphoria in autistic individuals, about 20% or actually a little bit more than 20% of females, about 30% of females reported some kind of gender dysphoria, and around about 15% of males reported some kind of gender dysphoria. And down the lower figure here, you can see the various forms of the gender dysphoria. In the female ASD group, by far the largest reported themselves as genderqueer or other, whereas in the males with autism, the largest groups were transgender and bi-gendered individuals, as well as those who were males saw themselves as traditional females, and those who were female saw themselves as traditional males. I probably just said something extraordinarily confusing when I said, let's go back a slide. Now, when I said those who were females and those who were males, what I mean, females assigned at birth and males assigned at birth. Right. Now, so let's look at some mental health results. Typically developing individuals had a relationship between gender dysphoria and their number of autistic traits, and that was quite strong. You can see that effect there as quite strong, but within autism, that effect was not apparent. Once you'd crossed that barrier and had a diagnosis of autism and an AQ of 32 or greater, and we excluded any individual who had a diagnosis of autism but an AQ less than 32, and we excluded typically developing individuals who had an AQ greater than 32, just so we could keep our sample clear and apparent. So within autism, there was no relationship between the number of autistic symptoms and your gender dysphoria score, but outside of autism, amongst the typically developing individuals, there was such a relationship. In fact, we found that as predicted, as your minority status increased, and increasing minority status goes down in this figure, we have typically developing here solely non-heterosexual, solely autistic, solely gender dysphoria, ASD and non-heterosexual, ASD and gender dysphoria, non-heterosexual and gender dysphoria, and all three groups, ASD, non-heterosexual and gender dysphoria here. And you can see we had reasonable size samples in all of those, and a fairly good sample of where all three were prevalent. And our mean mental health scores are given here. The higher the mental health score, the worse an individual's mental health. So as you became increasingly minoritized, your mental health reduced. In fact, the correlation between those was massive, 0.91. I don't think I've ever had a 0.91 correlation before in a result in anything I've published anywhere. When we looked at mental health among those with gender dysphoria and autistic spectrum, we found mental health issues in autism, and here's the autistic group here, here's the typically developing group there, and mental health scores are here. Again, lower the score, the better one's mental health. And we can see that straight across stress, depression and anxiety, and we have here reversed PWI, because well-being is normally associated with higher scores meaning higher well-being. We reversed those scores to get higher scores mean poorer well-being here in this particular instance. So reversed PWI means higher scores mean worse well-being. And you can see that in all instances, those with autism or autistic individuals had worse mental health. The same was found for individuals with gender dysphoria. In all instances, those with gender dysphoria had worse mental health. When we look at an individual's gender dysphoria score across the horizontal axes for well-being issues and mental health issues, we find the yellow dots are those with autistic individuals, the white dots are typically developing individuals, black line reflects the trend in typically developing, red line reflects the trend in autistic individuals. You can see that the two of them intersect at high levels of gender dysphoria, but that in both groups, increasing gender dysphoria is associated with increased mental health issues. When we look at well-being issues, and this is well-being in its normal direction, yellow dots, autistic individuals, white or greyish dots, typically developing individuals, black line, again, the trend for typically developing, red line, the trend for autistic. We can see that increased gender dysphoria in both groups is associated with reduced well-being. One of the things, though, that's quite important to note is that in the very highest levels of gender dysphoria, we only find autistic individuals. They are the only group that appear there. And in fact, higher increasing levels of gender dysphoria were found to be much more strongly associated with autistic individuals. So, what's the relationship between well-being and AQ scores? Not overall mental health, but well-being, as well-being is the product of mental health. And the number of cases of autistic individuals with well-being below 50 was alarming. Now, if you've got a well-being below a PWI score below 50, that within the well-being literature is generally regarded as, excuse me, the point of failure of well-being homeostasis. That is, the area where wellbeing defends itself. So you take a knock, someone says something nasty to you, you flip them off and put yourself back on your horse and get on. That's wellbeing homeostasis, defending your wellbeing. If your wellbeing is below 50, generally it's considered that you have wellbeing failure. And if we have a look here at this figure, we can see there's the 50, the yellow area that I've highlighted in the graph, and you can see there are vastly more individuals with autism there. In fact, 54% of those individuals with autism and only 21% of typically developing individuals had failed wellbeing. And the difference in those proportions is significant, massively significant. 41% of those with autism had gender dysphoria traits, also higher than the average for the typically developing, and they had well-being below 50. Again, this result was massively significant. So increasing minority status led to even worse well-being outcomes. Now let's have a look at some sexuality results. Now these results are brand spanking new in some parts that I'm going to show to you. Some of them are published previously in this particular paper, and some I've just done today. And so there's some really new stuff here. So this is the same group of people, but now we're looking at them, cutting them by their sexual orientation. And you can see that amongst the male and female individuals, there's much more variability in sexual orientation than amongst typically developing individuals, and that was highly significant. When we looked at sexual orientation by mental health, this result is not been published before. We can see that over all cases, the blue dotted line shows all cases, the trend for all cases. You can see that as your AQ score increases, your mental ill health increases. Within typically developing individuals, that solid black line there, you can see rises a bit, not strongly, but a bit. And within autistic individuals, again, you can see it rises a bit. Those results across overall are quite significant, and within typically developing and within autistic groups, they are significant results. When we break that down by heterosexual versus non-heterosexual, the results are not quite so clear. What we find for heterosexual individuals, the trend is pretty much the same. Overall group trend goes up, but within typically developing individuals, the trend is a little bit lower, but still there. Within autistic individuals, the trend is pretty much the same as overall. Remember, this is heterosexual individuals only. When we look at purely non-heterosexual individuals, those within group trends essentially become flat. The between group trend is quite clear, it's still there. Autistic individuals in both heterosexual and non-heterosexual have higher levels of mental ill health, but within the non-heterosexual group, as your AQ score increases, your mental ill health doesn't increase. What's increased is that if you're a member of the group of autistic individuals and of non-heterosexual individuals, your mental ill health is higher than amongst typically developing individuals. So amongst non-heterosexual individuals, within group differences don't matter much. It's the between group differences that do. In other words, being in a group of individuals with autism and non-heterosexuals means you have a much worse mental health. This slide just simply shows those scores broken down, all cases here, heterosexual cases here, gay, bisexual, and asexual. Just want you to be able to see that within the non-heterosexual groups, gay, bisexual, and asexual, the trends are largely the same as I was talking about. When we look at the well-being results again, we find, and this is simply looking at mental health as well-being in this particular instance, we find again the 50% point here, vastly more individuals with autism are in the low group than in among the typically developing group, and this pattern is repeated for non-heterosexuals and heterosexual groups completely. Now, before going on to just a quick discussion, I just wanted to raise something about another group of restricted individuals we didn't look at. We didn't look at gender. It's one of the things I want to, but another one of my students is looking at the outcomes for girls and women for mental health. And this is mental ill health measured as well-being, not as mental well-being, as DASS scores. The larger the sphere, the stronger the mental ill health. So the larger the sphere, the more mental ill health there is. This is year of birth across the bottom. This is year of diagnosis up the side here. And you can see that since 2010, there's been a lot more diagnoses. And for those who were born post-1990, there have been more diagnoses. The reason this cuts off at 2000 is we weren't looking at anyone under 18 years of age for ethical reasons. And these bands here show individuals aged 0 to 9. Very few people women are being diagnosed 0 to 9. Age 10 to 19, more are diagnosed in that age range. 20 to 29, more again. 30 to 39. And it's not just me just arbitrarily slapping these numbers here. You can see there's diagonal trends through the data. What's happening is people are getting diagnosed at ages, and it tends to happen in the younger ages more. Why? Because teachers notice it as they move through school. School events occur, such as transiting to high school. And more diagnoses happen in this group here. Why? Because mothers are getting diagnosed as their children get diagnosed. So women tend to be diagnosed above the age of 20, often in response to a diagnosis of their child, and have mental health diagnosis before their autism diagnoses. So women with autism tend to have a mental health diagnosis prior to their autism diagnosis. And here we have eating disorder data. This is the Z-score of the eating disorders. And you can see that these eating disorders are quite prevalent amongst women. Now, why I raise eating disorders is because eating disorders are actually the most dangerous of mental health conditions. The mortality rate in eating disorders is very, very high, around 20%, and across the life, that is, and the recovery rate in eating disorders is much, much lower. So, autism is generally associated with worse mental health. In those with non-heterosexual orientations, autism is associated with worse mental health as well. Gender dysphoria traits do not increase with increasing autism traits among those diagnosed with autism, but do among those not diagnosed with autism. And with increasing minority group membership, mental health issues are considerably increased. With increasing gender dysphoria traits, those with autism experience worse mental health and reduced well-being. So when you have two or more conditions together, mental health is considerably worsened. The frequency of failed well-being in autism is alarming. The frequency of failed well-being in autism with high gender dysphoria traits is very alarming. And girls and women with autism are an overlooked and often ignored group. We didn't look at gender separately in this particular analysis, except those last two slides, but gender results reveal girls and women are at severe risk. So, I hope I haven't bored you with my presentation or insulted too many of you. I suppose I open the floor to questions.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that presentation. That was fantastic. I know we all really enjoyed it. Another reminder I wanted to let everyone know of is that this presentation will be available on YouTube, and the link will be sent out after. So if anybody that you know missed the presentation would like to see it, you'll get access to a link after. So a few questions for you, Mark. The first question that I got was, how do you increase awareness about these issues to clinicians who may be unfamiliar with this area of research?
First thing is myself and my group try give presentations at clinical conferences as frequently as we can. One of my students is going to be presenting at the Australian Psychological Society Clinical Conference, and I present regularly at clinical conferences myself, although I could present at a lot more if I had more opportunity. We publish as often as we can and present it as widely as we can. But other than that, things such as today is the strongest thing I can do. It's very difficult to communicate this information to clinicians who are often busy and overwhelmed with a host of issues. As I mentioned through the talk, I'm a clinician as well. And I was just looking yesterday at my professional development requirements. Fortunately, because I publish a lot, I don't have to do a lot of other things. But I was looking at them thinking, gee, a lot of clinicians who don't do what I do would have to put a lot of effort in to get their professional development points. And I was thinking, what are they doing when they're making their choices? And what they're doing, of course, is exactly what I do, is they're looking for the maximum points for the minimum effort, because like most people who are clinicians in one way or other, their lives are fairly busy and hectic. My wife's a clinician, and she's committed to work somewhere in the region of 100 to 120 hours a week. We get to spend very little time together, and that's not a complaint, by the way. I do complain about it, but I'm not complaining to you. Her role or life as a clinician is deeply committed. How does she find the time to learn this? I'm not sure, but I think providing this kind of information, providing webinars, YouTube presentations, conference presentations, that's the best way we can do that. And word of mouth.
Great, thank you. The next related question is, as an autism treatment network, what could we do to make sure that screening for mental health is implemented on a large scale, especially in the disparate populations?
One of the things that one of my students, in fact, the student Claire, who was working on women's mental health, these figures here, those results there, pointed out, and she works also in one of the autism support organisations here in Australia, MAAAS. What she pointed out was that clinicians should be doing a basic series of evaluations of mental health whenever they're undertaking an initial diagnosis or assessment of autism, and that should be repeated regularly with individuals on the spectrum who may or may not need support or intervention. And the tools to do this are not terribly difficult to use, nor are they terribly hard to access. The DAS is available online. It's free. It's a very simple instrument to use. If it's not free, sorry, it might actually incur a small charge, but it's not very large. The PWI, which is a 7-question instrument, and we're working on it at the moment to try and reduce it to 5 questions, is an extraordinarily robust and reliable instrument. It's very easy to score. In fact, you can score it in your head in seconds. And individuals could collect that data when they're screening or seeing individuals with autism. And so that would then give you an insight to mental health. I think that's one of the most important things to do. assessing someone's mental health by turning around and saying, oh, how are you feeling today, is really not sufficient. I think a standardized, stable form of measurement is necessary, and using tools such as the DAS and the PWI, I think are pretty much essential.
Thank you. The next question says, what barriers have you encountered thus far to acceptance of your findings based on culture or health system?
Strangely, I've not found barriers to accepting my findings in a large part of the world. Look, Australia, United States, UK form by and large the largest body of scientific researchers working in this area, and by and large my results are not challenged on the basis of culture. However, we did some work on cross-cultural issues some years ago, on sexuality issues some years ago in India, Singapore and Australia, and those results have actually never been published other than in conference, because every time we try to publish them, someone argues, oh, well, you can't make these inferences because of cross-cultural issues, because of that. And we find cross-cultural things get in the way of those results all the time. And the interesting thing about those results is they demonstrated very clearly a strong cultural effect on sexuality and sexuality related issues in autism, which suggests very clearly something that Kirsten Gries-Lord from the Netherlands has demonstrated, and Elizabeth Lagerson from LA have demonstrated, that these things are learnable. Understanding sexuality and the intricacies and the deep intimacies of the way sexuality is communicated in society is learnable, because the cross-cultural results show differences, and that therefore shows that depending on the culture you're in will determine something about your understanding. So what kinds of cross-cultural things have we found from my results? For some of them, no problems at all. For others, quite a lot of problems.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one last question, which is, what do you believe to be the best way to address this disparity in mental health and gender and sexual minorities in individuals with ASD?
That's a kind of, it's a very difficult question to answer, and it's very difficult to answer not because I haven't got a perspective, I do. It's difficult to answer because I'm a clinician and a researcher, and I think the advocacy of individuals with autism needs to come from those with autism, which it's doing now. And I think that advocacy is a very strong way for people to gain mental health. When you start advocating for yourself, you're starting to move down the road to mental health. So what do I think are the things that could lead to that? I think the things that can lead to that is for our research community and our clinical community to support individuals on the spectrum to advocate for themselves, to support individuals to argue for social goods to be supplied to support them. In Australia, we've just recently developed, we have a nationalised healthcare system so that everybody in Australia has access to universal health. And we've just actually started a universal insurance scheme for individuals with a nominal disability. Now, I use the word nominal disability there because I think autism and many other conditions are not truly what I think. I don't think the word disability is an appropriate word. Different ability, perhaps, or differently able, yes, but within the context of a society in which you live, many of these individuals are disabled in that they don't function in a way, well, they function in a way that rather leads them into trouble by other people's non-acceptance. Now, we have this National Disability Insurance Scheme, and that scheme, I hope, as it's being implemented, I hope will lead to improved support for those with autism to advocate for themselves. That's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to provide a fund for those with a condition that's recognised by the fund, resources for them to be able to advocate for their own needs. And I think in doing that, encouraging people to advocate for their own needs is one of the strongest things you can do to engender mental health, because it means that a person's looking at what they need, what they want, and what's reasonable for them to get. And they're making informed judgments about the way they fit in society, the way society should reasonably adapt to them, and the way they should reasonably adapt to society. In other words, they're making much healthier decisions rather than ones about anger and mere rejection. So I think supporting people to advocate for themselves, that's the strongest thing we can do.
Great. Well, I think that's all we have time for today. So I just wanted to say a big thank you again to our presenter, Mark, for this fantastic presentation, and that I will be sending out the YouTube link to everybody who attended after this so that we can share it to more people. Thank you very much, Mark, and have a great rest of your day.
You too, Lucy. Have a good evening, all of you over there, and it's just the start of my day here.